Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us. Yes, just introduce myself. I'm the product marketing manager here at C2C Systems, and yes, I'd like to take probably about half an hour or so, talking really about PST files, or personal archives as otherwise known, and how to manage those, and particularly in relation to critical projects. Right, our agenda for this afternoon, I'm going to start by talking really about PST files or personal archives, a bit of an overview of those, where they came from, what they're used for, what's good and bad about them. And then moving on to looking at some projects that people are likely to be undertaking sort of now or in the near future, and really why PST files can cause problems for those projects. The projects, there's virtual desktop and or bring your own desktop and virtual desktop, Office 365 migrations, and the legal side of e-discovery and e-disclosure. And they're going to look at how those problems can be addressed in a number of different ways. Looking at the various tools that are available to address those problems, both from Microsoft and from third parties, and then a Q&A session at the end. And if you do have any questions, then if you can key those in, type those into the webinar panel on the right, and then we'll pick those up at the end. Right, to get started, what are PST files? It's something that end users may not be aware that they're actually using them. They may not be aware of the word, the acronym PST. It actually stands for Personal Storage Table, but I don't think anyone ever calls them that anymore. But that's where the acronym PST comes from. And really, what they do is to store email locally. So this is email that's arrived via Exchange and Outlook, and end users are able to store that locally. It was available by default in Outlook 2003 and 2007. In later versions of Outlook, it's turned off by default, but so not as many people may be using PST files as used to be, but certainly there's a lot of legacy information out there from for the years people were using Outlook 2003 and 2007. And because it was available by default, these files are found in most organizations. I wouldn't say all, but probably most organizations, end users have PST files. But as I said before, users may not actually know they're even using PST files. So why have PST files? Where do they come from? Why are they useful? And really, they're useful to solve a number of problems. I mean, the biggest one is overcoming mailbox quotas. And this probably is more historical when we used to restrict the size of our Exchange data store. And so end users were limited to a small number of megabytes or gigabytes in their mailbox. And so the practice started of saving mail externally into PST files to take it out of the mailbox and therefore enabling end users to stay within quota. It's also PST files are also used as a long-term storage location by some organizations. It's just a convenient way of effectively archiving. And thirdly, they're useful for moving email between locations or other people. So really, they're a solution to a number of problems. And I mean, why they are potentially a good solution is they're extremely easy to use. That's why they've become so widespread. They are very, very portable. I mean, you can put a PST file onto a USB stick or a DVD disc and take it elsewhere. You can load it on a laptop. So they're very widely used. So many people use them for many different purposes, and quite often things that weren't even thought of when PST files were first invented. So how widely are they used? And the answer is probably extremely widely. But most organizations don't know how many PST files are being used within their organization or how widely they're used. So this is a major issue with them, that administrators typically don't know the scale of the problem that PST files might cause. I mean, they may well have many thousands of PST files scattered across desktops and machines within their organization. When we're talking to organizations, we find on average that they have between 2 and 4 PST files existing per active mailbox. So for instance, if you've got 1,000 active mailboxes in your organization, you've probably got between 2,000 and 4,000 PST files sitting out there in various locations. And each file can typically contain something like 10,000 messages and attachments, which might actually add up to a gigabyte of data at least in each file. So that's a lot of data out there. So one of the things to bear in mind is the scale of the problem and the volume of data that's contained in those files. But they're not really a good solution. They're actually used to solve a number of problems, as I said, that weren't even thought of when PST files were invented. They weren't designed to solve these problems, and therefore they're not a good solution for solving those problems. And this has been an issue that IT administrators have been facing up to for a number of years. And particular reasons why they're not a good solution is that they can be located almost anywhere within your company or organization. You know, they can be on end-user devices, laptops, PCs, tablets, or they can be on network drives. But they are typically under end-user control, so they're not managed by administrators. And so this means that they are really unmanaged storage. It's out there and nobody's actually looking after them apart from the end user. And the second problem is that they do contain business critical data. They contain information that has been used to run your business over a number of years. And so that information could potentially be useful. It certainly was critical at some point. So we have the situation of business critical data being secured in what is an insecure location. Quite often that data isn't being backed up. You may have a policy of backing up laptops and PCs, but how do you know that you are actually doing regular backups of all those PST files out there? As I said, they're very easy, they're very transportable, easy to move around, so they can often just be lost or misplaced. So business critical data could just be completely lost or misplaced, particularly if somebody leaves. If it's on their laptop and they leave, then that information could be lost to the business. And lastly, that PST files are simply a file format, and they're not particularly robust file format, and so they're quite liable to being corrupted. And there are a number of tools out there for fixing corrupted PST files, which I think gives us an indication of the fact that they're not a very good way of storing information. So that's a quick look at PST files. So let's now look at some examples of projects where PST files can cause a problem. And we'll start with virtual desktop projects or bring your own device projects. And these are ones where the whole nature of the end user interaction changes. And so they may have had emails stored in PST files on their device. If you then move to a situation where they can bring their own device in, then existing data on their old device is going to be lost until they move it. And typically they're not going to want to keep company data on that scale on their own device. Or if you're moving to virtual desktop infrastructure, you really don't want to store any data locally at all. So in both of those cases, the idea of using PSTs to store data just doesn't work anymore. So something needs to be done with that data, or else it will be lost. So that's the first type of project that we've identified. The second type of project I want to look at briefly is migration to Office 365. And I've picked Office 365 here, but it probably also applies to migration to any other cloud solutions, such as Google or locally hosted ones. Now, when you're migrating to Office 365, you really want to maximize the advantage of that. You know, cloud storage is cheap and there are almost unlimited amounts of data you can store there. So you really want to take advantage of that. You really want to consolidate all your existing data into that place. You really don't want to have any data stored locally. And this is often linked with the virtual desktop or bring your own device projects that I talked about just now. And also, once you've migrated to Office 365, one of the advantages of that is you can access Office 365 on any device from anywhere. So obviously, you want to have all your data in Office 365 rather than on a local device. So that's Office 365 or Google migrations are the type of projects that we are seeing driving the need to resolve the PST problem. And the third type of project that we've looked at is the legal ones of e-discovery or e-disclosure, as we call it in the UK and in Europe, or implementing a legal hold policy. Now, in these when you get into these situations, this is typically a situation where an organisation is required to retain and present information relating to particular events or situations. And this will include all the emails, so potentially if a potential legal situation has arisen, all relevant data must be identified and secured. And that could or should include data in PST files. Legal people will, if they are aware of the existence of PST files, then they may well ask for data in PST files to be collected. So all relevant data must be collected. So the question is, how do you actually locate and manage all that PST data? Another thing that might well come out of this is that as we get more and more litigation, companies might start to implement retention policies where you should only retain documents and data such as email for 2 years. But how do you know that you've got data out there over 2 years old, sensitive data that you should be deleting? So it all drives towards collecting data from PST files and migrating that elsewhere centrally so that you can do things like e-discovery and e-disclosure. So that's 3 types of projects that we've identified for which PST files cause a problem. There are many other projects, similar projects, and other scenarios that we're coming across. So what's the solution to these problems? Well, Microsoft invented the PST file in the first place, and so that they've actually come up with a solution to the problems that PST files address. So in the Microsoft world, the whole idea of using PST files has now been replaced by the concept called the in-place archive. And if you're familiar with Exchange 2013 or Office 365, you'll be aware that there is the in-place archive facility. And in Office 365, that is an almost limitless archive facility. They've just increased it to at least 50 gigabytes for enterprise level users. So the in-place archive is in Exchange 2013 and Office 365, and it replaces personal archives or PST files. And of course, the advantage of this is that all that data is retained centrally within Exchange. And I mentioned before there's unlimited storage, so the need to store data locally to get over quotas goes away completely. And also, they've made it a very similar user experience to PST files. If a user is used to using a PST file as a personal archive, then the facility in Exchange 2013 or Office 365 gives them a very similar experience. So going forward, there's really a good replacement for PST files. There is no reason to have PST files anymore. But the problem is you've got to move from where you are now to that new solution, and I will talk about that in a minute. Of course, there are some other solutions available rather than using the Microsoft solution. You could decide that you want to keep all your PST files centrally. This is a partial solution. It gets over the problem of having PST files out on end-user machines. It means that the data can be managed and backed up. And you can also prevent users from creating PST files locally. So that's a partial solution which gets over some of the problems, but it's still not looking actually at allowing you to actually do much with the information that's within those PST files. A better alternative could be to use a third-party archiving solution, which will provide secure storage for business-critical data such as email. And I've mentioned here that C2C, we have our own product, our own archiving product called Archive1, which fits this role exactly. And of course there are other products available from other vendors. So that's another alternative solution is to migrate data from PST files into a secure third-party archive, where again you can easily retrieve it and interrogate it and search it. So those are the two solutions, or three solutions, to the PST problem. But as I said, you have to get from where you are now to where you want to be. So what I want to talk about now is how we actually implement the solution, whichever solution you've chosen. So if you've chosen to move to Office 365, you've chosen to use the in-place archives, whether you've chosen to use local storage, network storage rather, or if you've chosen to use a third-party archiving solution, you still need to firstly locate all those PST files. You need to go out and find them wherever they might be. You then need to migrate those into your chosen solution, and then you need to eliminate them from where they originally are. So there are still three stages to actually implementing the solution. And I'll look sort of briefly at each of those three stages. So let's look at locating PST files. And locating files is a challenge. As we've said, PST files can be scattered almost anywhere across your organization. And most IT departments, they know roughly where to look. They know they're going to be on network storage, they're going to be on end-user desktops. They know pretty much where. The trouble is how to go looking for them. And this becomes quite a major project when you start thinking more closely about it. It is quite a lengthy process to locate all of those files. You know, if we're talking about at least up to four files per mailbox, that's a lot of files you've got to try and find. And there could be files from people who've left around. You know, there could be a lot of odd bits of files looking around, so it's going to be quite difficult, but luckily there are some tools available to help on this process. Once you find the files, you need to identify an owner for each file. If the PST file is currently in use, if it's actually attached to an Outlook profile, then that's relatively easy. If it's not, then you need to actually look in at the file contents to actually determine who is the likely owner of this file. You know, some files may be orphans. They may be created by people who've left, people who've moved on using different machines, and all you're left with is a PST file. You don't know who it belongs to. And then until you've worked out who it belongs to and what the contents are, then you can't decide what to do with it. So identifying an owner is a key part of locating files. Once you've located them, you then need to look at migrating or moving them. And this also, of course, is a challenge. You really only want to migrate what you need to keep. So you want to delete any old PST files that are no longer relevant. You know, for instance, if a file is over 2 years old, you may say you're not interested. So you may want to delete anything over 2 years old. For other files, you may want to delete only the old data or unimportant data within those files and just keep the important data and just migrate that to your chosen solution. There are three options for migration. The first one is just to ask users to migrate them. This is quite possible. You can ask a user to copy a PST file into a mailbox, and you can give them instructions on how to do that, and that will work. Trouble is, it's a lot of effort to try and get all your users to do that, and probably they don't want to do it anyway. It's not in their interest to do it. They've got other things to do. So that's not really a good solution for more than a handful of users. Of course, Microsoft have come up with a solution as well, and they've produced a a PST Capture tool, and that is useful in some scenarios. Or there's quite a few good third-party tools out there as well, which can help you in the whole migration process. Something to bear in mind when you're doing migration is looking at the resources that you're using for the process. We talked about the amount of data that can be in PST files. And so therefore you need to carefully look at the amount of bandwidth you're going to be using for doing migration and the amount of storage you'll be using during the migration process. This will be a significant project, so you need to manage the impact of this project on your ongoing production live operations. And then finally, once you've migrated the files, you want to delete them afterwards. You need to finish the job. There's no point in migrating PST files and still leaving them there. So we believe it's very important to delete existing files to avoid confusing users and also to regain the storage that they're using rather. And lastly, you need to prevent users from creating any new files. And this is quite easy. There's actually some settings in Outlook that you can change using group policy to prevent users from creating new files. But that's just something that to remember when you get to the end of the project is before you finally finish it, is to wrap it up by cleaning up so that no new PST files are going to be created. So I mentioned the Microsoft PST Capture solution a couple of minutes ago. This is Microsoft's solution for migrating PSTs. And this was originally a third-party tool. Microsoft bought it from a third party a couple of years ago and enhanced it a little bit. And what it does is searches for PST files and it imports them into either Exchange or Office 365. And that really it's not a bad solution for smaller organizations. It works quite well for smaller organizations. But it does have limitations. It can only migrate PST files. It can't move or copy them to a different location if that's what you want to do. But more importantly, it doesn't scale very well. So for larger organizations, it's not a particularly good solution. I've picked up on 5 problems here that it can't process PST files which are open in Outlook. So you'll need to get your end users to close the PST file before it can process them. There's no automation or scheduling of migrations in there. So everything has to be scheduled manually by the administrators. It doesn't have the ability to process data selectively. For instance, you can't say only migrate anything younger than 2 years. It'll just migrate everything. It doesn't do the cleanup that we talked about afterwards. It doesn't disconnect or delete PST files after they've been processed. And lastly, it only supports Exchange 2010 and Exchange 2013 and Office 365. And probably half companies out there, half the organizations out there are still running Exchange 2003 or later. And it doesn't support, only supports 2010 and above. So if that isn't suitable, then the thing to do is to look at the other third-party tools that are available. And I'll just talk briefly about PST Enterprise, which is our C2C's own migration solution. There are other solutions out there, of course, but I'll just go through PST Enterprise and explain how that works. It can locate PST files across the organization. It does this automatically and identifies the owner for each file, which, as I said, is quite an important part of the task. And then once it's located those files, it then migrates PST files automatically. And it can migrate into Office 365 or Exchange 2013 or into third-party archiving solutions or direct to a centralized storage or network location. So there's a lot of flexibility there in migration options. And lastly, it eliminates the PST files. It does the last stage of deleting after processing. So really, it's very much an end-to-end enterprise-level solution. It's highly scalable and highly automated. It can process files and data selectively, so you can set fairly complex rules as to how it's going to behave, and then really just let it run, and it will make intelligent decisions based on the rules that you've created. It's constructive to minimize the impact on your network and your network resources, and it's got quite complex controls in there to make sure you can manage that. And it also provides you with progress reporting, so you can see the state of the project and you can take appropriate action on any problems that are occurring. And of course, we'd be quite happy to talk further about this, of course, if you're interested in our PST Enterprise solution. And I'd like just to finish by talking very briefly about a case study. And for today, I've picked the case of an insurance company in Canada. That I'm not able to name them, but they are a leading insurance company and financial services organisation. And they've got over 5,000 workers, so that's over 5,000 desktops distributed across North America. And the problem they faced was that following an acquisition, they had a lot of their users had PST files remotely sitting on their desktops and machines, and they needed to bring all those PST files into their central exchange environment so they could manage it correctly. Now, being a financial services organisation, they're under quite strict regulatory compliance, and so they needed to consolidate all their email into Exchange. And just as importantly, being a distributed organisation, they needed to make sure it didn't interrupt day-to-day operations. And they went with PST Enterprise, and that has enabled them quite successfully to systematically locate PST files on all the end-user machines and network locations across their organisation. And as I've talked about before, automatically determined and assigned an owner for each of those files. And then finally ingested that data from the PST files, taking the data directly from where it was in place, directly into Exchange. And they ran that as a fairly lengthy project, logically across all their users. And they ran it to completion quite successfully. And their feedback, once they completed, was that they found the solution to be quite simple, and they leveraged the flexibility to adapt the processing to their particular environment. So they were able to write some custom scripts and things to actually customize the operation to their particular environment. And as the director of IT says here, if you can see that the quote, the tool is the core of our migration process. Because it was SQL-based, it was simple to create custom SQL scripts and extend this flexible tool to run the batch type processes they needed. So they were very, very comfortable with that, and I think particularly it was the enterprise nature of the solution is what really made it work for them.